Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Photo Hour, our second one, I suppose. But it's great to have you back. Hopefully, you had a little bit of a chance to play around with your cameras yesterday and got to fiddle with things a bit. I'm just going to have a look here. I've just had a bit of audio trouble this morning, but I think it's working all right now. My producer's telling me that it's okay. So thank you, Mel. But we'll keep an eye on it, and hopefully it doesn't give us too much grief while I'm talking. Welcome, everyone. Yes, lovely to see you here. So today, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about pet portraits, which is pretty exciting. I actually love taking photographs of pets. I find it's really easy to do around the home, and it's wonderful to have some nice photos and create some nice memories of our animals. We're going to start today with just a photo, one of my favourite photos I've ever taken, actually, and you've already seen it if you saw the starting soon screen, but it's a photograph of my pet dog. His name was Jack, and unfortunately Jack's no longer with us. But the reason I wanted to share this photo with you was because, I'm so happy that I have this photo of him. It's a photo of him sitting in his favourite spot. And every time I look at that, I get quite emotional, really, thinking about that animal because, we have such an emotional connection with our pets. And it's really important that we get good quality images of them because, our pets unfortunately don't live forever. And when I look at this photo, I think about all the times I had playing with Jack. I think about him lazing around the house. He's got this really sort of stoic stare in his eyes, which really reflects, I think, his personality in his old age. And I just, I'm so grateful that I had a photo of this. It was taken a couple of days before he died, actually. So it's, you don't want to miss out on these opportunities because when they're gone forever, and you're never going to be able to recreate them. That's we're going to see a lot of photos today. Actually, I've been busy taking photographs of my girlfriend's cat Chandler. So she's got a couple of nice snaps of him to print off and put on her wall or something like that. And we're going to talk about a couple of different aspects. We're going to talk about the creative aspects of pet photography and also the technical aspects as well. I'll stick to the creative stuff first. It's possibly the more interesting, fun stuff in my mind. But it is good to know some of the technical things because you need to be able to take a little bit of control back in order to get good photos of your pets. Now, when I'm taking photos of pets, I definitely have a certain aesthetic. I really like sort of pensive photographs where they look like they're sort of lost in thought. That's my particular sort of what I prefer subjectively, I suppose. But you could also get, playful photos of your pets playing with toys or running around the house and that sort of thing as well. There will be slightly different settings that you'll need to use depending on the kind of photograph that you're going for and depending on what the pet's doing. So we'll get to that when we talk about the settings portion. A lot of the things we're going to talk about today too also go on to regular portraits, so don't think that everything I talk about only is relevant to pets. It's relevant for people too. And so we'll be able to use a lot of these techniques through pet portraits, through regular portraits, and even just through general areas of photography as well. A lot of these ideas sort of transition from genre to genre. All right, so anyway, we'll get into it. The first thing we're going to talk about today is composition. And I'm going to give you a couple of little sort of tips, I suppose, on how to compose your photos. Now, the first thing I'll say with composition is that don't think that the rules need to be followed necessarily. It's good to know the rules of composition. It's good to have an understanding of why they help draw the eye around the frame, but you learn the rules to break them. So a lot of things with photography, I always say if anyone tells you there's a right way of taking a photograph, I do the exact opposite because it's going to mean that you'll probably get a more interesting result. But it is good to know the rules, master them, and then you can start to break them creatively down the track. Now, when we're composing a photo, what are we trying to achieve? Well, what we're trying to do is subtly direct the viewer's eye around the frame. So when someone's looking at a photograph, you don't want them to be erratically looking from place to place and really unsure what the focus of the photograph is. So we use composition in order to direct the eye towards something specific that we're wanting the viewer to actually look at. And in pet photography, generally that'll be the pet's eyes. We always want to be focusing on the eyes because the eyes are really what creates an emotional connection with the animal. Same with regular portraits. You know, there's an old saying, the eyes are the window to the soul. And you really want to keep that saying in the back of your mind while you're photographing your pet, because if you can create a nice connection with those eyes, then you'll get an amazing photo. And a lot of the things we're going to talk about today are really going to be emphasizing the eye in the actual frame. Anyway, let's jump over to some photos and have a look at some examples of these things. I'm just going to pop back to my screen here. And I'm going to start with one of the classics, which is the rule of thirds. You might have heard of this one before, but basically, if you haven't, you break your image into three. So you've got top, middle, and bottom, left, middle, and right. And you've got lines that you can put things on, and also intersections that you can put things on as well. So in this photo here, we've sort of got Chandler's face falling around about where the intersection is on the top right-hand corner, and then we've got his legs sort of falling where that left line sits. Now you can see that, you know, the leg isn't exactly on the line, but you get the idea. We don't need to necessarily follow these rules exactly, we're just using them as a guideline. And what that does is it draws our eye towards the top of the frame here, where Chandler's face is, where his eyes are, and that's really where we're wanting the focus of the shot to be. Just another example of that here, so a profile photo of Chandler. And again, you can see that his body pretty much takes up that left-hand side third of the frame, with his face falling on the intersection of the left and the upper line there. So different composition, but following those same sort of general rules. All right, another rule of composition, which you may have heard of before, is leading lines. So the way that when human beings, when we look at photographs, we tend to instinctively follow strong lines throughout the image. And what we've done in this photograph here is we've used a paw to create a line to Chandler's face. There's the rule of thirds in play in this as well. If you drew that grid over the top, you'd find that his face is about at that upper right intersection and the paws at the lower left intersection. But when we look at this photo, our eye sort of follows this path along the paw and ends up where his face is. And there's a couple of other things that are helping us do this too, such as the focus, and we do that using the aperture, which we talked about yesterday. It's another example of the leading lines here. So a photo of Chandler in the hallway, and we've got these lines created by the wall and the rug, which push our eye up to the top, and we sort of stop where Chandler's face is sitting. We've even got lines in this one created by his paws as well. So his paws are forming this nice little triangle underneath him, which help push our eyes up to this portion of the screen. And again, you can see the rule of thirds in play. Face is pretty much sitting on that top upper third. What else do I want to say about leading lines? So I suppose you've seen two examples here. One where we've used the sort of environment to create a line in the image. We're using the actual wall and the rug. And another one where we're using his body to create lines within the image. So you can find natural lines in both sort of natural, man-made and natural structures. But think about how you can start to use those lines to direct the person's eye towards your pet's face. One thing I'll say is you've got to be a little bit careful with lines, because you don't want to have a line sort of starting in the middle of the frame and then pushing off to the edge. Because what that does is it sort of pulls our eye away from the image, and it actually gets really hard to look at a photograph where you've got a strong line leading off the edge. Generally, you want your lines leading into the frame. Another last little compositional rule we're going to talk about is called lead room. And what lead room is basically is leaving more space in front of your subject, so more space in front of where the subject is looking into than behind them. And what this creates is it feels like we're sort of looking with the subject, and it feels like they've got some sort of breathing space, so they're gazing into something. If we sort of cut the photograph off here so that they were looking, right off to the edge of the frame, it feels sort of a bit claustrophobic, and it doesn't have as nice a sort of feng shui or energy as it does when we've got extra room leading into the frame. Now we call this space over here negative space, which is sort of empty space that is devoid of detail, but it's a compositional tool where we can start to use that space to create certain sort of moods in the photograph. And we see two examples here again, that photo we saw before with the rule of thirds of him looking outside a window, and then the photograph on the left-hand side here with him looking into a window on his bed there. So there's some general compositional rules. We'll leave that there for now, but there's a few other things we'll sort of talk about as we go along. The next thing that we're going to talk about is focus. And this sort of ties in yesterday to what we were talking about with aperture. So when I'm talking about focus for the moment, I'm talking about creative focus. We'll get to the technical focus in a little bit when we get to the technical side of the class. But we use aperture in order to control the focus of our subject, how much of that subject is in focus, and how blurry the background is. And in all those photos I showed you of Chandler just a second ago, I think they were all shot at f2.8, which, if you can remember from yesterday, is a very wide aperture, which means we've only got a shallow bit of the subject in focus and the background goes blurry very quickly. Now, human beings tend to only like looking at sharp things. We don't tend to like looking at blurry stuff. So if you've just got one thing that's in focus in a frame and everything else is blurry, then that's another tool that just helps our eye go straight to the thing that's focused, and we don't get distracted by all this other stuff in the background. So we always want to make sure that the eyes are in focus, and we can use aperture in order to keep the eye sharp and start to make everything else blurry as a little bit of a compositional tool as well. The next thing we're going to talk about is angle. And generally, as a rule of thumb, what you want to do is get onto eye level with your subject. So I'll jump back into some images again now here, and we'll have a look at some more photos of Chandler. But this goes for people as well. So when you're photographing people or animals at different angles, what happens is you're creating different power dynamics within the image. And generally, you want to have a neutral-ish power dynamic, though if you throw the angle off one way or another, it'll create a certain sort of mood. I tend to sort of start at eye level when I'm taking photos of people and move from that, depending on what sort of feel the pose is. But generally, if you're shooting an animal lower than them, then you're giving them the dominance within the frame. It'll make them feel like they're a bit more authoritative, a bit more heroic. If you're coming at them from a higher angle, then it'll sort of diminish their presence within the frame. They'll feel a little bit inferior, a little bit belittled, a little bit vulnerable. So depending on what sort of mood you want in your image, maybe depending on the expression that the animal is giving you, you might want to change your framing up a little bit. Now, this photograph here is a photo of Chandler shot at eye level. Pretty neutral sort of pose. What I prefer though is actually from a bit of a slighter angle, and this is moving maybe only about 10 centimeters or so, but you can see just by that slight movement getting slightly underneath Chandler, it really does give him a bit more of a position of sort of authority. It's giving him a bit more power, and I prefer the sort of mood that I'm capturing in this second image rather than the more neutral photo on the left-hand side shot from a neutral eye angle. When we're talking about angles, the other thing we can talk about too is the background, because we need to be careful of our background as photographers. It's very easy to get tunnel vision and sort of just, get focused on the animal, not think about anything else, and then you look at a photo like this later and you see this big green sort of fluorescent blob in the background, and you think, oh bugger, I wish that I didn't get that in the photo. So when I'm taking images, once I sort of I'm happy with how my subject's looking, I'll quickly just dart my eyes around the frame. So left to right, up to down, and think, okay, is everything in this photo working for me? Is the background working for me? Is the foreground working for me? And if not, I'll slightly change my angle to the left or the right in order to compose that image slightly differently. And if we look at the second photo here, just with a slight movement to the right, you can see very similar feeling shot, but we don't have this big distracting green blob in the background, okay? And it takes a little bit of practice. You sort of got to use your peripheral vision, a little bit in order to get the feel for these things, but it will come with practice. And another thing I would say too is don't feel like you always have to shoot from the same angle. So, when I'm photographing something like Chandler, this is all done maybe over the course of a day or two. What I did was I just had my camera sort of sitting on the table, and whenever he was lying in a different spot or sitting somewhere differently, I'd pick my camera up, start taking a few photographs. Chandler's a very grumpy cat. He really tends to not like me as well. I've been dating my girlfriend for about 8 months, and I think I've probably only patted Chandler 6 times, and I reckon 3 of those times he's probably scratched me back. So we have a bit of a tenuous relationship, Chandler and I. But I pick up my camera, take photos of him for maybe 15, 20 minutes. He'd get annoyed, run away. I put my camera back down on the table, and I come back, in an hour or two and take some more photos. But I just kept my camera sitting on the table so that whenever he was doing something, I picked it up and I was ready to go. All my settings were done, all I needed to do was pick it up and shoot. So I'd recommend doing that, setting a little bit of time aside, each day to take photographs of your pet, because you can't tell them what to do. The pets are going to do what they sort of feel like, and you can control them a little bit, but it's really up to them whether they want to sort of pose for you or not. So you're at the mercy of their schedule in a lot of ways. Now, all these photographs I've used are shot with natural window light. And I really love the look of window light that you get for portraits. And it's particularly good to use window light at home. My preference, definitely, for pet portraits is to shoot a pet at its home. And while you can get some really captivating images, I've seen amazing photos of dogs and cats in studios with studio lighting. For me, they always feel a little bit artificial, because when I think about my pet or my old pets like Jack, I think about him sitting in his favorite spot in the sun, or Chandler cuddling up to his bed. They're the photos that really have an emotional resonance to me, seeing my pet in its place. We tie so much emotional resonance into our home and into the people and things that occupy it, that I think it's really nice to merge those two worlds together. So all the photos are shot using window light, and they're a very nice soft light. I have these huge, Mel, sorry, not me. I keep referring to this as my house. I got to remember, it's not mine, it's Mel's. But she has these huge set of windows all along a balcony. So it's a very, very large soft light source. And just very quickly to sort of summarize light, the simple rule is the larger the source of light, the softer the light. The smaller the source of light, the harder the light. So if you've got a very small window in your room, you'll have a relatively hard light source. If you've got very big windows, you'll have a very soft light source. Sometimes that means moving around the house a little bit. We'll have a look at some photos again in a second. But one tip, someone asked me yesterday how you get the animal to sit still. One of my little tricks is to position their beds or their cat scratches or something like that near the source of light. So what I did to take these photos was I moved Chandler's bed next to the window, because I knew that was going to give me the best light, and I knew that if I moved the bed there, he would go there eventually. Same with his cat scratcher. So while I can't tell Chandler to go, hey mate, can you go sit over here for a second, I can subtly direct him to where I want them to go, just by moving those sort of objects that I know he's going to interact with at some stage. Let's jump back to some photos and have a look here. So there's two main sources of light that I've used in these shots. There's sort of side light and there's also a backlight as well. The photograph of Jack here was using backlight too. If we're going to talk about these light sources a bit for, I suppose, I might get rid of this one for the second. We've got this photograph here, which is this very soft light source, and we've got this nice sort of light wrapping around Chandler. If we were shooting this in a studio, we'd call it short lighting, because the light's illuminating the shorter side of his face than the broader side of his face. So all those sort of principles of lighting come across to pet photography as well. Whereas this photograph of Jack on the right-hand side is shot under hard light. So we've got sun streaming in through the window, actually hitting the animal, and we're getting this beautiful rim light around his face here, which is really sort of pulling his face out of the background, because the background's this sort of wooden cabinet that's in shadow. The backlighting is a little bit harder to use. You've got to be a little bit more careful with it, but it is sort of going to be more useful. Well, it's one of those things it'll give you a different sort of look. Let's talk about some other kind of lights. All right, so I'm going to talk about some more photos. I've just realised my camera's turned off, so I'm getting my producer Mel to have a look at that. I just put the mic on pause for a second so I could give her some instructions. But let's talk about some photos in the meantime. You don't really need to look at me anyway. You really just want to look at the photos. That's the interesting part. All right, so this is another thought of backlighting. I just wanted to bring this photo up because I'm not super happy with the pose in this photo. The pose here, I have this rule when you're photographing animals, and that's face first, bum last. And that sort of principle applies even to photographs like this here, where his face is sort of turned away from the camera. Generally, I like the face facing towards the camera. And that's from sort of like directly side on to directly in front of the camera as well. So, while I like the lighting in this photo, unfortunately, the pose didn't work, and you get photographs like that where poses aren't going to work. The trick there is just to take a lot of photos, and you should get something that you like eventually. It just takes a little bit of time. If we look at these photographs here, just looking at the light, again, the one I prefer is a bit more of a subjective question, but I prefer this photograph on the right-hand side because we're getting this nice light falling into the eye here, whereas on the left-hand side, the eyes are pretty much in shadow. And it's nice having this sort of illumination in the eye because that's what really creates a connection with the animal, and it feels like they've got a bit of life. If they've got no light in the eye, they can start to feel a little bit like taxidermy or something like that. Now, I often prefer photos where they're looking into the light, and that's also going to give us this sort of look. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about as far as the light is concerned is catch light. So I'm going to go back to this photo here, which has a nice catch light in it. But what you can see in this photo, if I zoom in, we're getting this sort of specular reflection from the outside in the actual image. And we call this a catch light. We typically want one of these in every photograph that we take because that's what, again, gives us life in the photo. So it's not always going to get this. Generally, you need your subject to be looking towards the light in order to get this catch light. And, as I said with the composition, there's no reason to always follow these rules. You learn the rules so you can break them. But generally, these catch lights will feel like there's a bit of life in the shot. Alright, so that's everything I want to talk about with light, and Mel's managed to fix my camera for me, so thank you, Mel. We'll give her a round of applause. Considering that she's not a photographer, I think she's done pretty well there. I saw her madly pulling plugs and pushing them back in. Technology, hey? Just can't catch a break with this stuff sometimes. But anyway, we'll keep going. The last creative thing I want to talk about before we start to get into the technical side of things is poses with the animal. We'll go back to have a look at some images in a second, but different poses is going to create different moods within the shot. So we were talking about before how we're changing our angle. So by getting higher or lower, we can create a different feel within the image. And the same goes for your pet. Depending on whether they're looking up, looking down, they're going to get different sort of feelings in the photo. And what I would do is take as many photos as you can with different poses, so they're looking left, right, up and down, and that way you're going to get lots of different feels to your shots, and you can go back and sort of pick your favorite one down the track. Alright, so let's jump back and look at some images, look at some different poses, and I'll tell you the things I'm sort of looking for when I'm taking photographs of my pet. Let's get rid of them there. Alright, so we've got two photos here, Chandler looking down and Chandler looking slightly up. And photographed from a similar sort of spot, photographed from a similar sort of angle, similar sort of composition, but two very different feels to this photograph. The photograph on the left feels a little bit more pensive to me, a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more sort of melancholy, whereas the photograph on the right feels a bit more stoic, a bit more heroic, Ken's looking directly into the light source, and all this is just a very slight adjustment of his chin. If we go down and see another example here, so again looking up and looking down, very similar sort of shots as far as their composition and content goes, but again I would say the one on the left feels a lot more pensive than the one on the right, which feels this sort of more hopeful. Just another thing about these photos too, in regards to what I was talking about before with the light, I much prefer the light in the photograph on the left-hand side because Chandler's looking into the light source and we're getting this light washing over his face from front to back. Whereas the photo on the right-hand side, while I really love the expression on his face, to me the lighting is just a little bit boring because his entire face is in shadow, so we're not getting this nice sort of transition from dark to light across his face. Or while he does have a catch light, his eyes are feeling a little bit sort of dull. Now, I might be able to fix this a little bit up if I do some post-production to it, a little bit of dodging and burning or something like that. But yeah, it's not quite as nice a photo outside of frame, in my opinion. I just want to show this photo here. So this is one of the throwaways. And I just wanted to bring it up because this photo ticks a lot of the sort of boxes that we were talking about before. You know, we've got this leading line created by the paw. Chandler's face is on the rule of thirds. We've got this nice side lighting and this nice illumination in his eye here. But it's a bit of an ugly pose. So because he's got his face sort of pressed in against his body, he's looking a little bit chubby in this photo. And I wouldn't say it's super flattering. This goes for people as well. But generally when I'm photographing animals, what I try and do is I try and think of not just the animal and their expression, but also their silhouette and the sort of shapes that their body is creating. So, you know, the way that they're sort of twisting their head and their body in sort of conjunction with one another. And I try and move my camera or move myself rather, so that I'm accentuating certain sort of silhouettes to get some nice curves and some nice angles moving throughout the frame. I love angles in my photographs. Angles are always very dynamic. So rather than sort of like straight up and down parallel lines sort of things, try and mix up some angles, zigzag around. You'll get a more dynamic sort of shot. All right, so that's all the creative stuff I want to talk about. I've been keeping an eye on the comments here, but no one's asked a question just yet. You're welcome to ask questions in the comments section. I'll have a look through at the end and answer any of them if you do have any questions. But otherwise, hopefully, maybe I'm just covering everything, which is great. All right, let's get to the technical stuff. We're going to start with focus. So focus is the most important technical attribute of your photo. It's always very careful that you nail focus because focus is one of those things you can't fix in post-production. With exposure, there is often a little bit of latitude, so we can make things brighter or darker if we need to. But if your photo is blurry, you've messed it up. You're just going to have to throw it away and start again, basically. Let's jump back to some more images and have a look here. I just wanted to show you, and I'm not sure how this will come through with the resolution that we're streaming at, but this is a photograph here where I missed focus. And you've got to be very careful with this when you're shooting with these very wide apertures like 2.8, because it is very easy to miss focus and have their eye not sharp. So this is the larger photograph on the right hand side there, but if I crop in, what I've actually focused on in this image is Chandler's cheek. So this fur up around here is nice and sharp, but his eye's blurry. And because that eye's blurry, I've missed the shot. There's no saving that. Unfortunately, if that was the one time he did that moment, it would have been gone. So we want to make sure that we're nailing focus every time. Now, I'm going to talk about a few focusing techniques, but what we're actually going to talk about tomorrow on the photo hour is focusing. So we'll be expanding on some of these things here. I'm just going to sort of plant the seeds for the terms at this stage. Now, what I use is a single focus point. So what that means is that I've got this really, really small area that the camera is choosing focus on. And the reason why I choose that is that I want to always make sure that the eye's sharp. And I'll move that area around the frame until it's over my subject's eye. That way the camera isn't getting confused and focusing on the bed or the background or something that I don't want to be sharp. And in particular, it's not going to make that mistake as much of focusing on the cheek. Because cameras generally focus on the thing that's closest to them. So, for example, if I'm facing the camera like this here and you don't have a very small focus point, it's likely that it'll actually focus on my nose and my eye could be blurry. If I'm turned like this way, then it might focus on my ear and my eye's blurry. So by having that small, precise focus point, it avoids that problem. I also use continuous autofocus as well. So when continuous autofocus photos is updating focus is updating continuously while I've got my finger half pressed down on the focus button, which is often the shutter button as well on most cameras. So I press my finger halfway down, focus, 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 and then when I'm ready to take the shot, fully click, take that photo. But I try and get my camera focusing before the moment happens, because if you try to get focus while the animal's doing something, it's too late. You've already missed the moment. You really want to have the camera ready to go, so when that moment happens, boom, you can click away and get the photograph. Now, the other thing I want to talk about with focus is that the way cameras focus on things is that they look for contrast in the image. So you need to be making sure that you're pointing that focus point over something that's got contrast, that's got texture and detail. I'm going to go back to this photograph of Chandler here just so we can see this. But generally, the good thing about photographing animals is that the eyes generally have a lot of contrast in them. Particularly Chandler here, because he's got a green iris and a black pupil and then black eyelids around there. There's lots of contrast between those details, so the camera doesn't have too much trouble focusing. But when you've got dark colored animals, so this black fur over here, for example, because there's not as much contrast in this area, the camera can often have trouble focusing on these parts. So you've got to be a little bit careful of this, particularly if you've got an animal with dark fur and dark eyes, because it may not be a lot of contrast there. You might be able to bring out a little bit more contrast just by improving your lighting, so getting them closer to the window or something like that. All right, what else are we going to talk about? Exposure next. Beautiful. Exposure. We're going to get into this more down the track. So we talked about aperture yesterday. We're going to talk about shutter speed before the end of the week as well. And then we're going to talk about manual exposure next week, I think. Maybe end of this week. I forgot my schedule already. I forgot it yesterday too, and I've looked it up since then. I've got a terrible memory, clearly. But with exposure, if you're using a mode like aperture priority we were using yesterday, the camera's finding out what it thinks to be the correct exposure for you, and then we can change exposure using something called exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is a little dial. Basically, you put it into the plus numbers, you get things brighter, put it into the minus numbers, you get things darker. Try and find that term in your manual. It's a fairly general term you use between the manufacturers, but generally it'll be somewhere either in your quick menu or you'll have a dedicated button for it. On my Nikon here, for example, I have a button up on the top, a plus minus button. Camera's just going off again, so I'm going to get my producer to have another look for us. I'm not sure what is happening with it, but it's not playing ball. So let's just look at some photos while I'm talking about these things. Apparently it's... Alright, so I'm going to put some nice little photos of Chandler up and I'll talk to them instead. All right, so with exposure compensation is one way that we can adjust the exposure automatically when we're shooting in an automatic mode, but we will get to that more specifically down the track. Another thing I want to talk about in regards to exposure, particularly with animals like this here, where we've got very dark black fur and very bright white fur, you've got to be very careful with your exposure because it's easy to lose either shadow detail or highlight detail. So it is very easy to lose detail, say in this part of the white fur here, where we've got the sunlight hitting that, and it's very easy to lose detail down in this corner here as well. We've got the sort of black fur and shadow. Now, for the moment, if you're not too comfortable controlling exposure yourself, I would just sort of stick with what the camera gives you, at least try and capture the moment, if nothing else. However, once we get a little bit more of a feel for these things, we can start to control this stuff ourselves. The next thing I want to mention is shutter speed. Camera's working again. I'm going to jump back over. Imagine if I was doing this myself. What a nightmare that would be. I'm blessed to have someone here to give me a hand. All this streaming stuff, I tell you, it's fun to do. I'm glad we can do it, but it drives me up the wall sometimes. The next thing I want to talk about is shutter speed. And we're going to talk about this in a couple of classes too. But we generally want our shutter speeds to be relatively quick when we're photographing animals. We use shutter speed in order to control motion in the image. And if you've got an animal that's sort of moving, posing, doing different things, you want to have a shutter speed that's quick enough to keep up with them and to be keeping them nice and sharp between the frames. Now, the shutter speeds I use for images tends to be between sort of maybe a 200th of a second to about a 1,000th of a second for pets. 200th of a second will be okay if they're just sort of sitting and quite lethargic, and just sort of like slowly moving their head or their body around. But if they're running around playing with a ball or something like that, that means you need to increase your shutter speed. So that's when you start to get to a 1,000th of a second or so, maybe even quicker if they're a really quick animal, in order to capture and freeze that motion. Now, in order to control both the shutter speed and the aperture, we need to jump into manual exposure. So we haven't quite gotten there yet, though we will. But the way I shoot portraits like these is I shoot in manual exposure. I shoot with a manual shutter speed and a manual aperture. So generally a wide aperture for a blurry background, a quick shutter speed to freeze the action. And then I leave my ISO on automatic. And that way I can change the brightness of my photo using exposure compensation. So it's a great way of shooting in manual, but having a little bit of automation with your exposure, because as the pet's moving, you don't want to have to be fiddling with your exposure settings all the time. The more you're fiddling with the camera, the more you're missing photos. A couple more things I want to talk about. Burst shooting is useful as well. So there's something called a drive mode on our cameras. What you might refer to sometimes as continuous shooting or burst shooting. Has different terms for different manufacturers. But what that'll do is when you hold your finger down, the photo will take camera will take lots and lots of photos. So the way on this Nikon that I turn burst shooting on, I have a little dial up here that swaps my shooting modes. But you might find that in your quick menu, or you might have a button for it as well. But have a look for those terms: burst shooting, burst mode, continuous shooting, something like that in your manual if you can't find where to change it on the camera. Now what that does is it means often, a lot of these photos that I've taken of Chandler, for example, a photo of him looking up and looking down, it might be just sort of a movement like that. And if I'm on burst shooting, I can get a range of motion there, and depending on what mood I sort of want, I can go back and choose either head down or head up. But I've got the choice. The other thing I'll say about burst shooting is that don't just sort of hammer that over and over and over again. You don't want to end up with 1,000 photos of the same thing. Generally, I'll try and sort of time it. So, click on that photo, half press my finger down, get focus, and again, wait for the moment, and then I click and hold my finger. And I take 4 or 5 photos, but, I don't want to end up with 1,000 photos of pretty much the same thing. So use it sporadically. Use it only when you need to. The last thing I'm going to talk about is focal length. So focal length, we generally have portrait and landscape photographs. I tend to stick to the portrait sort of focal lengths, which is about the 50 to 70 mm mark on your lens zoom. Depending on what sort of crop sensor you have or full frame, different sensor sizes change the focal length of images. So that comes into play as well. But if you stick to the sort of 50 to 70 mm mark, then you should get some pretty flattering sort of images. We'll talk a bit more about focal length down the track too. All right, so that's pretty much everything I want to talk about. I've got one question: do focus ring, focus dots, or points work with aperture focusing, or will one override the other? Okay, it's a good question. So there are 2 different ways of controlling focus. And I'm going to jump into this more tomorrow, so I'd recommend coming back then to learn about focusing extensively. But the camera only focuses on one plane, so actually an infinitely sort of small plane is what the camera focuses on. But then we control the range of that focus with the aperture. So the focus point controls the point of that plane. So if it's my eye, for example, this intersection here will be in focus, what the camera focuses on, but then I control the range or the depth of that focus using the aperture. So they're used in conjunction with each other. One grabs the focus and one stretches the focus in or out. There aren't any other questions. Hopefully that's answered it for you. So we're going to leave it there and we will come back tomorrow. Thanks for coming along. It's been wonderful to have you here. Tomorrow we will be talking about focusing, and again, we are doing online one-on-ones at the moment at a discounted rate of $99 an hour. So if you'd like to organise one of them to talk about these things more specifically about your specific camera, let me know and we'll organise a time. Wonderful to have you here. We'll leave it